Hello, New Covenant Parish and friends. Good to be with you to look at lectionary text for Sunday, November 22nd. I'll start by reminding you that this is the last Sunday of our church calendar year. A new year begins on November 29th, which is the first Sunday of Advent. We're almost there. That's the season in which we celebrate the birth of Christ into the world. But on the last Sunday of the Christian year, we celebrate the kingship of Jesus. And we begin to think about his kingship by looking at this Old Testament passage that thinks about God as a good shepherd. Now, if you've ever read through Ezekiel, it's full of oracles of doom and judgment. Oh, it's just everywhere. But this passage, in contrast to much of the book, is full of hope and comfort. This reading comes just after God has dealt with what the Scripture calls the faithless shepherds of Israel, referring to the kings of Israel, who did not take care of the people, ruled over them harshly, brutally, scattered them far and wide. But now, the scattered people are going to be collected together again through the grace of God. A portrait of God given here as a compassionate, dedicated shepherd, caring for his flock. And verses 11 through 16 paint this picture for us. This prophecy was written to the people who'd been living in exile in Babylon, and Ezekiel was one of them. And looking forward to the day God would redeem them from bondage there, Ezekiel's prophecy speaks of God as a good shepherd who gathers a scattered flock of sheep. The Lord will bring together the scattered people of Israel. The hungry sheep will be fed from the choicest pastures. The thirsty shall be led to mountain springs. The injured will be healed. The weak strengthened. All this is going to be done for the exiled people through the intervention of the Lord on their behalf, their personal God, who considers the people of Israel to be his own. And throughout this reading, you'll notice God's language is very personal. He says, I myself will search for my sheep. I will seek out my sheep. I will rescue them. I'll bring them out. We're reminded over and over here of the personal involvement of God with the nation of Israel, his people. This passage also had to have informed Jesus of his own understanding of his role as the good shepherd who seeks the lost. You read about that in Luke 15 and John 10. Moving on, the second part of the reading, verses 20 through 22, builds on what was said in verse 16, where in contrast to the Lord caring for the weak, now he promises to destroy the fat and the strong. Now, why is that? Well, because the fat and the strong have been instrumental in the persecution of the weak. Their behavior is bringing the Lord's judgment upon them. And in order to save the flock, the Lord would distinguish between sheep and sheep. So, God doesn't like crooked rulers, for sure, but he also doesn't care for pushy sheep. Sheep that are pushing around and mistreating other sheep. They get punished, which shows that the Lord's mercy is not given without discrimination. Also shows that how we treat each other matters greatly to God. It does. The final verses, 23 through 24, leave the theme of judgment and talk about the office of the Davidic king as a special instrument of the redemption of the people of God. As the Lord's representative, kings from the line of David will do all those gracious deeds that the Lord has personally set out to do. Only feeding is mentioned in these verses, but watering and healing and strengthening are implied as well. All the gracious deeds of the Lord mentioned earlier in the reading. Now, Ezekiel, in his prophecy, was mainly looking forward to the restoration of kings from the line of David following the end of the exile. Back in 2 Samuel, God had promised that there would always be a descendant of David as king of the people. But we hear in these prophecies a word that speaks to us also in our time. We hear the prophecy looking forward to David's ancestor, Jesus Christ. King Jesus, king like no other king, who we'll soon remember in Advent and Christmas as the incarnation of God's promise and the beginning of its fulfillment. And it's the second coming of this same Messiah we'll also be thinking about in the year ahead, who will ultimately be the completion of God's promise and of all the hope that Christ's people have placed in him. So right here, in this brief reading from Ezekiel, we look forward to beginning a new church year and telling once again the story of Christ and the good news of the gospel. So good to be with you today, my friends. See you next time.